Hi, I'm Steve Bryant from Risk Strategies Higher Education. Welcome to Tips from the Trenches, a series of video blogs where we discuss a variety of risk management topics from the perspective of a higher education risk manager. Today we're chatting about disaster recovery services. Why should we consider them? And some tips for choosing a partner suitable for your institution. Ideas for integrating those services with current policies, procedures, and practices. And we'll walk through the first 96 hours of a response. We will discuss the typical life cycle of recovery and restoration response and how the services provided can protect the reputation of your institution. It's an honor to have Tress Hurst joining us to share his expertise. Welcome, Tress. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Steve. My name's Trace Hurst. Formerly was in the Army for 26 years. I've been with one of America's premier disaster recovery companies for 13 years. As the Chief of Staff, my primary responsibility really is to oversee our crisis action team. I also make sure all of our leadership priorities are in place. So thank you again for having me today.
Well, thank you for joining us. It sounds like you've got a lot of boots on the ground type of experience, and that's what we're looking for. When we talk about disaster recovery, many times risk managers are familiar with continuity of operations plans. They're familiar with emergency response plans. But I found as a risk manager that I had not really thought of, well, what do I need help with after the response is over? What comes next? And I think that's where the disaster recovery services plays an important role in the trifecta of response to minimizing the overall loss to an institution. What are some of the reasons we might want to consider disaster recovery services as part of our quiver of arrows, if you will, that we can use to respond?
Sure. I think the first and foremost, one of the most important things is you really have to look at your disaster recovery vendor as a partner. And that partner can come to you and really act as a force multiplier. You're going to have a lot of good people on your team that understand operations, understand facilities management, actually understand construction, and probably all your mechanical MEPs throughout your property. But can they operate at the speed of which needs to occur when you do have business interruption? And that's where a good company comes in that understands how to sequence in the priorities, how to really come in and really become a partner, listen to what the requirements are on the loss, be able to prioritize those, move extremely fast, but with speed, but more importantly, be able to document that for insurable claims purposes.
Absolutely. The insurance is a key issue. MEP, what is that?
Mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all of
Thank you.
those nuances that we see, that sort of the devil in the details, where people think they have those things under control, but guess what? They have to be remediated. You have to clean those areas. A lot of times those are overlooked, and really you can't get your property back up and running unless your MEPs have been both inspected, serviced, and then really validated that they're working or not working.
Right. So we kind of jumped right into that. That's some very good information. You know, part of the challenge for today's risk manager, and I don't think it's going to change, is that rates are increasing. Insurance companies are increasingly more strict with their underwriting. They're asking more questions. You have to validate your property values, prove them up, if you will. Some are even requiring some appraisals. And one of the things that helps a risk manager sell his or her institution as a quality exposure for a carrier is the risk management plan. So how does the disaster recovery service angle fit into that overall risk management plan to demonstrate to the carrier yeah, it could happen, but we know what we're going to do.
Right. I think really first and foremost is you really have to look at that vendor and understand that do they have a demonstrable body of work? And more importantly, depending on what vertical market you're operating in, especially if it's in the education vertical market, how much experience does that vendor have working in the educational vertical market? There are a lot of rules and regulations when it comes to working in the education vertical market. So for me, if I'm looking at a vendor, how much experience do they have working in education institutions? And that can be K through 12, or that could be at the university collegiate level. I want to understand that. More importantly, how many small jobs compared to complex large loss jobs has that vendor applied towards an education vertical market? Because they do tend to make a difference. Day to day may not be an insurable loss. A complex large loss may be a hurricane or a tornado or a major flood that impacts a university or school district. Well, that's a whole different bailiwick right there. So I really want to understand what their body of work is, and then from there, being able to understand complexity of their body of work.
Okay. So having that experience on the line, if you will, should it be needed, can really help drive down the overall cost of the loss. Is that
Yeah,
kind of where we're
ultimately,
going?
what I want to try to do is decrease that business interruption at the end of the day. We're going to have property damage at that location. We're going to have inside where there's going to be property that's going to be damaged or need to be accountable for. But ultimately, I want to reduce that business interruption. I want to get that property back to pre-loss condition as fast as we can, but document everything correctly. That's the key right there. From the time a university or an education system has that business interruption, from the time that vendor is told, please come help us, from the time we have that first meeting, everything's documented, and we're really working on communication, uh, task, time, and then more importantly, cost, because everything needs to be documented for insurable reimbursement.
Oh, right, absolutely. A lot of institutions have their own operations, physical plant folks, as you mentioned earlier, and oftentimes there's a feeling that those people, as well skilled as they are, can handle anything. How, how do you how do you address that sort of a pushback?
I address it from a point that we're your interlocutor. So the more we can talk and discuss and understand operations and facilities priorities, they know what they need to do to get that property back up and running. We now need to come in and utilize our capacity with their institutional knowledge, blend those two together as rapidly as we can, and then move out to fix what needs to be fixed. And I can't overemphasize that operations and facilities personnel are competent. They know exactly what they're doing. But if we can come in and provide the necessary personnel and equipment, we can get them up and running in no time, no time fast, because they know their property, they know the ins and outs, and so we need to be that force multiplier to really get them up and going under their direction.
Mm-hmm. Maybe taking that a step further, Trace, the the operations division at an institution will likely have some contracts with local providers, uh, water extraction, those sorts of things. Maybe even some contracts with local building supply and materials providers. How does a disaster recovery service help augment that, or how can it enhance those areas? And multiple point question here, sorry. Do you interface with those local resources as I guess the right question is, does the disaster response company interface with those local providers for economy of scale or for economy of resources?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Stephen, and a very important one is because you have to give back to the local community. I can't overemphasize that. So what you don't want to do is isolate any type of capacity or vendors that a school may already be utilizing. You have to see how you can interface with them, work with them. And it's really all about giving back at that point in time. There is going to be a capacity. Normally it's supplies and materials. There could be a capacity issue with labor, having enough labor. But the more you can work with the local vendors and give them a piece of the problem to solve, then it just helps over a period of time. What you don't want to do is isolate local vendors with a school, unless the actual school leadership, those that have authority and approval, say, no, we need you to just take care of this problem set. But we find there's really a happy medium when we can use local vendors that the school has already vetted that are in their system on top of the capacity and the capabilities that a vendor like my organization would come to bear.
You know, we discussed a little bit earlier some of the pros and cons of disaster recovery services and the folks that deliver those. And you and I talked about a tactical to strategic disconnect. Um, and that is a reason for having a disaster recovery service provider. Help flesh that out. What does that mean to me as a risk manager? A tactical strategic disconnect. I think I know what you're going for, but
Sure. I think the first thing that comes to mind is authority and approval. Who's calling balls and strikes when you show up? A lot of times people will pivot to an individual that has to call, balls and strikes, but that individual may not have all the expertise, nor should he or she have all that expertise. We find out that it's really almost a trifecta, if you will. There's going to be some type of leadership that understands what the rules and regulations are. There's going to be some type of leadership that understands the risk and the wherewithal, the policy behind things. And then there might be a governing board, if you will, that leadership needs to brief up to for permissions. Where the disconnect somewhat goes is it's all about time. The operators, whether it's operations, facilities, maintenance, they know what needs to get done, but being able to get that vendor linked up with the operators to start at least doing the initial assessments, getting that property back to a sort of a safe environment so you can get the full rough order of magnitude and scope of work documented, that tends to get disconnected because one, although the vendor's approved to work, they may be waiting for other approvals. Those other approvals could take 2, 3, 4, sometimes a week to get approved. That's a lot of business interruption time you've really wasted, if you will. The quicker you can give that vendor the order to proceed, to come and make the site safe, to work with operations and facilities to walk the property, determine what actually is damaged, document it, get it back to the local school representation and the insurance representation, and then really work through what that emergency services recovery plan is going to be, the quicker you're going to get that property back to pre-loss condition.
right.
So a lot of disconnects between authority and approval, a lot of disconnects between communication, and then more importantly, sort of, you can't boil the ocean. So what are sort of the steps you need to take over those first 96 hours, as we talked about, to really get everybody sort of into a zone where they understand the problem, they can communicate the problem both up and down, but more importantly, allowing the vendors to do what needs to be done, working with the operations and facilities people at that university or campus.
And you mentioned something that I think is very important for a risk manager, and that is the rough order of magnitude. Uh, because that gives, well, let's describe what that is. As I understand it, that's where the disaster recovery specialist has the breadth of experience with similar type of catastrophes and is able to really develop a document that states this is what it's going to take to finish the job and this is the approximate cost.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. And there's really two components to it. The first component would be that scope of work and that rough order of magnitude for budgetary purposes says this is the emergency services that need to get done to stabilize the property. All right.
Okay. And that's a really important piece because one of the first questions a quality insurance carrier will ask is, we know you've got to get back in operations. How much do you need to get started?
Right. And so being able to say these are the emergency services, simultaneously having that rebuild, that reconstruction, that re-roofing component come in and be able to provide the rebuild component as well. So the first component is really stabilization of the property. Do we need temporary roofing? Do I need emergency shoring? How much emergency restoration, mitigation, recovery needs to occur to that property? And then once that property is stabilized, what is the rebuild component of that? All those have to be weighed in and they have to be sequenced in there. And that's very, very important because you're trying to get dollar amounts quantified in order to get it back out to market, in order to do what insurance needs to do to come back to the client and say, okay, we agree with this vendor, we believe that this loss is going to be X, and we recommend that they go ahead and proceed with the emergency services as fast and, you know, as diligently as they can go about doing it. Simultaneously, everything is documented every single day because you're working on, really on that sort of that phase one claim process.
Right. So from a macro level, Tress, do insurance companies appreciate the services that a disaster recovery company can provide?
They do from the standpoint if it is straightforward. There's no monkey business per se. Your documentation is correct. Keep in mind, there's not an open checkbook for any type of claim. That claim is going to be really into two buckets, emergency service and that rebuild component. It is all about reducing that business interruption, but more importantly, can that vendor give options to the client in order to get them back up and running? That school may be taken offline for 2 years. You know, what can that vendor do meantime to bring children back and get them back into classrooms? One of the things that organizations should be able to do, any disaster recovery vendor should be able to really provide sort of what I call turnkey services. The first one is they have to be able to conduct remediation and recovery efforts. They should have their own in-house construction capability and their own in-house roofing capability.
Oh.
But you can also expand that with premier disaster recovery companies because they have their own housing capability. They have their own food service capability, have their own environmental capability. If you can take those 6 services and bundle those up so it's sort of one call and one team coming to your aid, you're going to get that property up and running because you're going to give leadership options that are going to help the most precious thing they have, and that's the children and the community. And you're going to be able to get them back into a classroom a lot quicker.
Exactly. Delivery on the mission is of primary importance to the institution of higher education. So a lot of really good reasons to consider having a disaster recovery service on board as part of your team, the risk management process, risk management team. All risk managers work with limited resources. I don't know of any risk management offices that are staffed to the level they need to be, nor funded to the level they need to be. So building not only the internal teams with the operations facilities folks, but having those external partners such as the disaster recovery service that can help when times are tough,
Right.
and know how to do it.
Right.
Because how many risk managers go through a catastrophic event every month? I would suspect zero. Maybe some have had that misfortune, but not very many. Whereas the disaster recovery service companies, that's what they do. That's their job, and so they know how to do their job. A lot of good reasons to onboard and bring aboard somebody like that.